Welcome to Massey College. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers, and I'm the principal of Massey College. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to a very special event for Massey College. I first want to acknowledge that Massey College is built on indigenous lands, the lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. It's the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we want to acknowledge the great privilege that we have today to be on this land, to do this fabulous work. So I want to thank Professor Paolo Granata, who's a senior fellow at Massey College, for bringing forward this idea of celebrating Dante. Now it fits so well for Massey College to be a partner in this celebration. Number one, because we have many people at Massey that love books and we have a collection of rare books here. So we are a book history club of nerds. And so therefore we are so delighted to continue to celebrate this great accomplishments. I want to welcome our friends from Italy, because that's the second reason why we're so delighted to have you. You have among the Massey community great admirers and lovers of Italy, and we know that because we have many people that speak Italian around the college. So I just want to welcome all of you here. And without further ado, I want to welcome Consul General Sgro to welcome you as well. Consul General.
Buonasera, siamo qui per celebrare oggi la settimana della lingua italiana nel mondo, un appuntamento istituzionale che è stato appunto voluto dal nostro Ministero degli Affari Esteri e della Cooperazione Internazionale, e che quindi ogni anno siamo noi qui appunto impegnati nel celebrare la nostra lingua nel mondo, ovunque noi siamo, attraverso la rete appunto degli uffici all'estero del Ministero degli Affari Esteri, quindi la rete delle ambasciate, dei consolati e degli istituti italiani di cultura. This year, the Settimana della Lingua Italiana nel Mondo, the Week of the Italian Language in the World, marks the 1700th anniversary of Dante Alighieri's passing. The anniversary is commemorated in Italy and abroad with a year-long series of conferences, readings, performances, films, and concerts to celebrate Dante's legacy and influence throughout the centuries. This year, the Consulate General of Italy in Toronto, the Istituto Italiano di Cultura, Toronto, have organized several events to celebrate this anniversary, in collaboration with, among others, the Department of Italian Studies of the University of Toronto, starting last March with Toronto Salutes Dante, a unique tribute to Dante's poetry through multi-language readings of Dante's verse in more than 30 different languages, from Italian to languages from all 5 continents, and for the first time also in one of the Canadian indigenous language. The Italian Culture Institute in Toronto sponsored this first translation from ancient Italian to the Anishinaabe Bemoan language. Today's presentation of a magnificent handmade, illuminated, anesthetic copy of the Inferno, known as Dante Guarneriano, continues the series of events to celebrate Italy's Sommo Poeta, Dante Alighieri. The presentation is organized by the University of Toronto, Department of Italian Studies, St. Michael's College, and Massey College, in association with the Biblioteca Guarneriana in San Daniele del Friuli, one of Italy's oldest and most venerated public libraries, founded in 1466. The event is presented in collaboration with the Consulate General of Italy in Toronto e Istituto Italiano di Cultura in Toronto. In this regard, I would like to thank Dr. Paolo Granata, University of Toronto Professor and Senior Fellow at Massey College, for having spearheaded this important initiative. I would also like to welcome and thank Mr. Piero Valent, Mayor of the city of San Daniele del Friuli, for having brought to Toronto this precious copy of the Dante Guarneriano, as well as the professional amanuenses of the Scriptorium Foro-Iulense, who will illuminate us on the medieval calligraphy techniques that brought to us these artifacts that we are about to discover. I truly welcome today's relevant presentation that adds another important piece of knowledge to the extensive body of Dante's academic studies in Canada, promoting a better understanding of the Italian language and culture. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, my name is Luca Somigli. I'm currently the chair of the Department of Italian Studies here at the University of Toronto, and it's a pleasure for me to welcome our guests from Italy to our intellectual community. Italian has a long tradition in Toronto. We've been teaching Italian here at this university since the late 19th century, and of course Dante has always been central to our programs. In fact, as the consul kindly mentioned earlier, this year, the 700th anniversary of Dante's death was an opportunity to be involved in a number of projects, including Toronto Salutes Dante, where through a series of readings of the entire Inferno in a multitude of languages, including some native languages, Italian dialects, standard Italian, many Western and non-Western languages. We try to bring Dante to the larger community of Toronto and of Canada. Toronto, of course, Dante, of course, as I said, is kind of central to our programs, and it's an honor and a pleasure to have with us the delegation from the Biblioteca Guarneriana with this astounding reproduction of a very important medieval manuscript that they will introduce to us. I'm looking forward to finding out more about this project, but I will give the floor to my colleague, who has been in many ways the driving force behind this initiative, Paolo Granata, already mentioned a number of times, who is a media historian, a professor of book and media history at St. Michael's College, an associate member of the Department of Italian Studies, and a senior fellow here at Massey College. Paolo.
Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che la dritta via era smarrita. With these very words, these verses, the Divina Commedia begins. And so begins the Dante's journey into wonder and marvelous human nature. And so, with these very words, I wanted to start up and kick off our journey, the Massey Dialogue, and the Making of Dante Guarneriano event. And so it has been a long journey for the Dante Guarneriano, just arrived from San Daniele, Italy. And that's a great pleasure to introduce the mayor of San Daniele. Thank you to his kind availability, we were able to really bring this precious treasure of Italian culture, manuscript culture, to Toronto. I wanted also to mention the Scriptorium Foro-Iulense for actually producing this unique and aesthetic copy, handmade, hand-copied, with a lot of unique techniques employed to really reconstruct the making of the medieval book. And in fact, I wanted to, before introducing our mayor, I wanted to set the mood and see what's going on right here at Massey College. Ivano Cohen, master calligrapher at the Scriptorium Foro Iuliense, is working and he will be working all the time. So thank you, Ivano, for rendering your calligraphic art here today in real time. And so you will be able to see, thanks to our cameras and broadcasting technicians, the marvelous traits and strokes of his calligraphic pen. And so, thank you, Ivano. I want also to invite you all to join us virtually. So if you're watching this event on YouTube, please share your good vibes, share your comments, share your questions. We will be really happy to take them. And so here you are seeing Ivano working. Right? And so please share your comments and questions. We will be able to pick them and so to engage you in a conversation. Massey Dialogues are open to a community, a small community of, it's an in-person event, all vaccinated, tested according to all the COVID protocols, but we wanted to open up to the wonderful community. I think even people from Italy are watching now this live event. And so feel free to get engaged, feel free to comment and to share your questions, and we will bring you all, we will take your questions for a little discussion later tonight. And so, Mayor Pietro Valente, so thank you again for finding the straightforward path to Toronto, well, no pun intended, the straightforward path to Toronto. Thank you for coming here, and thank you for bringing this marvelous artifact, the Dante Guarneriano.
Sono io da sindaco e come città di San Daniele che ringrazio l'Università di Toronto, i college, l'Istituto Italiano di Cultura Italiana qui di Toronto per l'invito qui in Canada per portare il nostro Dante Guarneriano.
I'll translate step by step. The mayor is expressing his gratitude to Toronto, the city of Toronto, the marvelous Massey College hosting the event tonight, St. Michael's College, the Istituto Italiano di Cultura, and all the Department of Italian Studies, and all the institutions supporting and presenting this event.
Questo ottobre 2021 la Guarneriana ha compiuto 555 anni. Grazie al lascito di Guarnelio d'Artegna e poi di Fontanini, la comunità di San Daniele ha ricevuto in dono oltre 600 manoscritti e oltre 12.000 documenti, tra i quali il preziosissimo Dante Guarneriano, che è l'Inferno donato da Fontanini.
The Biblioteca Guarneriana in Italy was born right 550 years ago, a century tradition with thousands of manuscripts. In the very first cluster donated by Fontanini to really start up one of the oldest public libraries in Italy and in Europe as well.
La Guarneriana ha questi codici che San Daniele conserva, non sono proprietà solo di San Daniele, non solo del Friuli Venezia Giulia o dell'Italia, ma sono proprietà e un bene dell'umanità intera, che noi abbiamo l'onore e l'onere di conservare, di tramandare, di promuovere all'umanità proprio di tutto il mondo.
The Biblioteca Guarneriana is owned by the city of San Daniele del Friuli, and the San Daniele del Friuli owns Biblioteca Guarneriana, and not only. The Biblioteca Guarneriana is a treasure, the heritage for the entire human family. It's not just an Italian heritage, so the mayor is really opening up the idea that this marvelous treasure, the Biblioteca Guarneriana, it's a common heritage, a common good for preserving this Italian heritage.
In questo 700° anniversario di Dante, quale miglior metodo per promuovere il patrimonio guarneriano che portare qui a Toronto la perla dell'Inferno dantesco donatoci dal Monsignor Fontanini.
And so what a better opportunity to celebrate the 700th anniversary of Dante's death and the year of Dante. The world is celebrating one of the most important philosophers and humanists of all times, and so the city of San Daniele really wanted to take this opportunity to make the Dante Guarneriano really travel and spark our global imagination.
La coppia che è giunta qui a Toronto con noi è una coppia importante per la sua fattezza, è realizzata su carta fatta a mano al 100%, coinvolgendo dei ragazzi diversamente abili in un percorso di inclusione sociale.
This very copy, a static copy of the Dante Guarneriano coming here to Toronto as a result of a collective effort to really involve communities of disabled people to produce a unique artifact with handmade paper, handmade illustrations and illuminations. We will talk later about this. And so it's a unique opportunity for really preserving and showing the value of the community of San Daniele that together put together this beautiful artifact.
Grazie a Scriptorium abbiamo realizzato 13 copie di questo Dante Guarneriano, 3 sono per le istituzioni, una sta navigando sull'Amerigo Vespucci nei mari del nostro mondo, la nave scuola della Marina Militare, una è qui a Toronto e una andrà al Presidente del Parlamento Europeo il mese prossimo.
So 13 unique copies, anesthetic copies of the Dante Guarneriano have been produced by the Scriptorium Foro Iuliense in San Daniele, and 3 copies are actually traveling all across the world. The first one is on the Amerigo Vespucci, the ship of the Italian Navy, one of the most prestigious Italian ships. And another copy will be donated to the President of the European Parliament, and another copy is just right here in Toronto.
Le altre 10 copie verranno invece vendute, e gran parte lo sono già state, e con il ricavato circa $75.000 canadesi finanzieremo un progetto di ricerca in campo della sanitario e della salute.
10 more copies will be on the market for a unique cluster of collectors and donors to support charitable initiatives in Italy in response to the COVID pandemic. And so for about a total value of $75,000, the city of San Daniele will be able to really support the community and research in response to COVID, thanks to this beautiful artifact.
E questo ci rende orgogliosi perché il progetto Dante Guarneriano fa di sé un progetto di cultura, di inclusione sociale e di solidarietà verso il prossimo, proprio in un momento in cui tutto il mondo sta vivendo il tempo difficile della pandemia. Ecco che con la cultura, qualcuno dice che non si mangia, in realtà con la cultura si produce molta ricchezza, ma ricchezza economica e ricchezza culturale per quello che sono, diciamo, la crescita delle nostre popolazioni, dei nostri territori.
Well, in response to the COVID pandemic and the hard times we're getting through, this initiative wants to foster the culture as a value of social inclusion and the value for solidarity. This is the great value of the Dante Guarnerianos to really make San Daniele supporting culture, social values and solidarity.
In ultima voglio dirvi che la Biblioteca Guarneriana, proprio perché appartiene a tutti, è aperta ed accogliente, e quindi chi volesse venire a visitarla può contattarci, gli apriremo lo scrigno della Fontaniniana di maniera che possa studiare e anche godere delle bellezze come le miniature che trovate nel Dante e in tanti altri codici antichi che noi custodiamo per tutti quanti voi.
Thank you. With these final words, the mayor wanted to invite you all and visit the Biblioteca Guarneriana in San Daniele. So the biblioteca is open to all of you, and the mayor is promising to open the treasures and open all the precious bookshelves of the Biblioteca Guarneriana to enjoy the beautiful bibliographic heritage and items in the Biblioteca Guarneriana, including Byzantine Bibles and many other medieval bibliographic artifacts. And so the Biblioteca Guarneriana is open, and the mayor is welcoming you all to come to Italy and enjoy those valuable treasures. So thank you very much, Mayor. All right, and let's move on. Let's move on again with the first merry-go-round to really dive into the beautiful Dante Guarneriano. We invited two experts in Dante script, medieval scripts and medieval culture, to really, let you undertake a journey into the Dante Guarneriano to better know the making of the Dante Guarneriano. I have the pleasure to introduce our first expert, Nicholas Everett, after teaching at the University of Illinois, Chicago, Sheffield, Queensland, Harvard. In 23, fortunately, I will say, arrived to the University of Toronto. He's a fellow at Trinity College, where he also serves as a public orator. I would like to know more about this role. And his areas of research include early medieval Italy, medieval medicine, manuscripts, legal documents, and Latin philology. He is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society in UK. Among many other publications are Literacy in Lombard Italy, The Alphabet of Galen, Pharmacy from Antiquity to the Middle Ages, and Patron Saints of Early Medieval Italy. Okay. So, Nicholas, first of all, thank you for joining us to explore the making of Dante Guarneriano. And the making of Dante Guarneriano in the very book, I will say, it's an expression of Dante as a book. I like to call it the Dante's bookness, the idea that the book can really fire the global imagination as it did back in the medieval times and still today. So, how can we enter into Dante's mind? How can we better understand the historical, philosophical, political context of that time to take the most of the bookness that eventually Dante was able to render into this masterpiece? What's the best way to really understand the value, the relevancy of Middle Ages through Dante?
Oh, tough question. Anyway, thank you for having me, everyone. And mi scusate se parlo in inglese, ma sono stato chiesto. I want to try to address your question, Paolo, because it's a big one, by simply saying that I think Dante, for historians, is one of these striking figures who expose, I think, a lot of the assumptions we have about the Middle Ages as a stagnant, boring period full of superstition and dominated by the church. And he's also one of those figures that challenge the periodization between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. He is undoubtedly medieval. The first two-thirds of his life are in the 13th century, and I don't think anyone would claim that isn't medieval. But he's very much a Renaissance figure with the part of his life, which is really the second part of his life, into the 14th century as the scholar in exile, scholar and poet in exile. So in some ways, Dante's very career also reflects that caesura between the two centuries. As a young, up to 35 years old, he was very much, before his exile, and before he wrote the great works that we're celebrating today, he was very much a politician in Florence. We don't know very much about his life there, but we do know that he was engaged in most of public offices in Florence. And two things stand out to me. One is when he was 24 years old, he fought at the Battle of Campaldino. So he actually was battle-hardened. He really put his political beliefs on the line, as it were. And the other thing that strikes me, just as a historian of medicine, is that when in about somewhere in the mid-1290s, Florence issued a law that said any noble who held public office, and Dante had held several offices, must be now enrolled in one of the city's guilds or professions in order to keep going. Dante enrolled in the guild of pharmacists, and people have speculated why he did that, and some people have said, well, pharmacies sold books. But another reason is that pharmacies made a lot of money, because Florence had a particularly different tradition from the rest of Italy, and in fact the rest of Europe, about regulating medicine, and in fact had quite a wild pharmaceutical scene in which doctors and pharmacists collaborated. So there may be other reasons for that. But in any respect, even after his exile in 1301, Dante's life changes. So in some ways he's now sort of dedicated to literary works. He never stops being a politician, even from a distance. He's still involved in the politics of his time. And again, his career reflects that change in the centuries between the 13th and the 14th. In the centuries, the Italian city-states of Tuscany were engaged in a wonderful experiment of representative government, the communes. And Dante is really the last gasp of that as he fights for the civil rights of his commune against papal interests and into the signoria of the 14th century dominated by aristocracy. But it's a wily politician, I think, someone like Dante, who actually supported the anti-papal side in his city to end up getting sanctuary with the Pope after he was exiled from Florence. So that's, you know, some sort of, I think, measure of his diplomatic skills. And with that particular promotion by the papacy, at least in those early years, that enabled him to shift, I think, career and also find a new life in the last third of his life, which he dedicated to literature. And in that sense, when we look at that 14th century and looking forward, we see Dante is very much a pioneer in the vernacularization of literature. He's a trendsetter, but he did follow trends in some ways. Vernacular would be around. The Sicilian poets were in the 13th century, the troubadours. He admired these people a great deal. And in some ways, he took what he found there and made it something new, dolce stil nuovo. But also, in some ways, he ushers in a whole sort of field of the vernacularization in Europe, right through literature, which was in some ways the last bastion. In some ways, Dante promoted the writing about vernacular in vernacular, where Latin was still such a dominant literary language. And by the end of the 14th century, we see vernacular sort of dominant now in sciences and medicine and other fields that we didn't see it before. So he's a pivotal figure in so many ways between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and it's very hard to pin him down for that because his imagination, I think, encompasses both worlds. When he's dealing with political philosophy, he's wrestling with issues of emperor versus the Pope. He really believes in papal power. In that sense, he remains medieval, but in his outlook in terms of finding a combination of the two or a compromise, he's really searching for answers that I think point towards the later 14th century in many ways. So, as I said, he's a pivotal figure that sort of disrupts our comfortable notions of what is medieval and what is Renaissance, and for that we should always be grateful.
And well, this is wonderful. Thank you, Nicholas. And well, seeing Dante able to really, well, a turning point and able to express the coexistence of the two cultures and the transition between the two. And so maybe now we know better why and how Dante was able to really render into the Divina Commedia an intersection of faith, ideas, politics, philosophy, and all those worlds connected each other. So I'll be back to you later, Nicholas. We have more questions and probably even for the audience. So just a reminder, friends on YouTube, if you just log in on Google or YouTube, you can share your comments or your questions, and we will be very, very happy to take them. Okay, so please share your comments. And so let's move on. First merry-go-round, and well, I missed the one presentation actually. This beautiful book, it's on display in a perfect replica of a medieval desk, a medieval lectern, usually located in scriptoria, where medieval books were produced. And so, thanks to our partners, we were able to make a replica of this lectern and the medieval desk, including all the tools that the scribe used to employ for the making of the medieval manuscripts. And so you will be able maybe to see some color pigments and quills and ink and all the tools, including we have some parchment and handmade paper. So all these beautiful artifacts, they really speak to the variety of techniques and know-how that were encapsulated in the making of a medieval manuscript. And so, to really dive into the manuscripts, I'll turn over our next guest, Michel Mulken.
currently holds the Leonard Boyle Chair in Manuscript Studies at the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies, known as PIMS, and is the director of PIMS' new diploma program in Manuscript Studies that was inaugurated at the American Academy in Rome in 2011. In her research, she has made a study of a medieval Dominican order and its schools and techniques used by the friars to communicate their learning. And her works have become a touchstone in the field. And I wanted to point out her current projects include a study of Dante's teacher, Remigio de Girolami, is revealed through some newly discovered manuscript survival, so an ongoing research into the world of Dante and the medieval manuscripts. And so, Michelle, I wanted to really give you the word and maybe point out the rise, talking about the rise of the vernacular culture, the intersection and the intersection between vernacular language and Latin, how the actual copy of the Dante Guarneriano can express this intersection between different maybe scripts, different calligraphic styles, what we can learn from this very actual copy in the canonization of the vernacular language in relation to the actual script employed by in the Dante Guarneriano. Michelle.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And yes, I did want to pick up on what Professor Everett was saying about vernacularization. And in a large part, what we are referring to there is this recognition of the identity of the national languages and the national interests of the period. And Dante, we're used to thinking of him as someone who was perfectly fluent and conversant in the Latin learning of his age, but whom we also associate with giving new power to the vernacular, to his language, his native tongue. And indeed, the Commedia itself is an experiment in showing the power and the flexibility of this language, the fact that Italian, his version of Italian, Tuscan Italian, could express very sophisticated ideas in philosophy and theology and other areas. And the fact is, when we look at the creation of manuscripts and we look at the Commedia itself as an artifact, that dialogue between Latin and vernacular is also evident in manuscripts. Manuscripts themselves reflect those changes. There are certain, if you will, rules of production for Latin manuscripts and certain rules of production for what increasingly becomes this world of vernacular manuscripts. So I take the script, for example. You mentioned the script. We talk about the script. When we have Latin manuscripts, the gold standard in which Latin manuscripts have been copied for 100 years and more at this point had been a script we call Gothic, various forms of litera textualis Gothica, a Gothic script. And Latin works from university texts to collections of canon law to the sermons of preachers are copied in this Gothic hand. But alongside this international bookhand, as we see this increasing consciousness of the national languages, there are these other more workaday scripts that are evolving as well, the sort of things that are used in national chanceries for the writing of letters, for drawing up of contracts. In Italy, for example, notaries wrote their contracts and the various things they took down in something that looks a little bit more cursive, a workaday hand, based on the chancery scripts that we refer to as cancelleresca. Well, when this new interest in the national languages and their literatures come along, we see a conscious decision made that manuscripts in Latin are going to be made in one way and vernacular manuscripts another. And one main choice is that the vernacular manuscripts choose the national hands. And for example, the Commedia is a perfect example of this insofar as the vast majority of the manuscripts of the Commedia were copied in what's known as cancelleresca, this more workaday Italian business hand, if you will, a calligraphic version of it, but cancelleresca. And the point being, all you had to do was open one of these manuscripts, and before you read a single word, you're getting the visual cues that are telling you this is a work of vernacular literature, and it has a different sort of identity. Now, not all manuscripts of the Commedia were copied in cancelleresca, and the great exception is manuscripts like the Dante Guarneriano we have right here. And what you'll notice is different about this is the text doesn't travel alone. It's surrounded by a commentary. You have the text in the middle and then this apparatus that surrounds it. This is a text that has a text commenting upon it. And that page layout is very typical of university texts, texts that tended to have a standard apparatus, a commentary that traveled with them. And this page layout of text and commentary is exactly what's being imitated in the Codex Guarnerianus we have here. And the fact of the matter is, when you open this manuscript, you see that the two things have been combined. You have the choice of a Gothic script, but also this page layout that conjures the world of Latin learning. And again, if you look at this manuscript, because it has that commentary, we're in the world of a more learned approach to the Commedia. What it's telling you, again, without reading a single word, is that this is a text that requires attention. This is an authoritative text that's weighted with learning. So the very choice of script will communicate, again, the visual cues that you're dealing with a work of traditional learning, or you're dealing with this brave new world of vernacular literature.
Wonderful. It's wonderful to see how one book can really speak so many languages, so many visual elements, are so relevant still today. And I was wondering, I'm going to turn over the mayor to how the Scriptorium Foro Iuliense in San Daniele, how they were able to reproduce, replicate the techniques and technologies of handmade writing to really produce this beautiful artifact. Can you tell us more about how they actually made that book? What's the unique features that really make this copy so gorgeously illustrated and illuminated?
Il primo problema da risolvere è stato la realizzazione del foglio di carta. Doveva essere di formato molto grande per essere identico all'originale. Questo vuol dire che i ragazzi devono avere una forma grande, pesante, da gestire per raccogliere il cotone e fare in modo che il foglio venisse steso bene.
So the first issue was to replicate the exact size of the manuscript of the codex, and so they wanted to employ handmade paper, and so they had to really make the right size using a quite large form or a mold to scoop, to lift the paper and make the exact size of the original manuscript. So paper making, first challenge solved. Then
Dopo anche la realizzazione del numero di pagine da rilegare assieme in una sola volta, e quindi anche qui abbiamo copiato dall'originale, la stessa composizione l'abbiamo riprodotta in questa copia.
Second challenge was to replicate the book binding. So employing the original medieval techniques, they had to deal with a large number of leaves in order to bind together the whole manuscript, the whole book. And so a philological study of the book binding techniques allowed the Scriptorium Foro Iuliense to replicate the same fashion way, the same book binding as the original codex manuscript.
Poi ci sono stati i lavori che hanno riguardato il colore della scrittura, del testo, e quindi la scelta degli inchiostri, e questa macchina speciale che ha contribuito a realizzare la copia.
And finally, the technique, somehow a convergence of modern technologies and the oldest and writing technologies. So using the anastatic process, they were able to replicate with a very high level of exactitude the actual script. When the illuminations, illustrations, gilding and rubrications have been handmade by the scriptorium for Oriental, replicating the same techniques employed in medieval ages.
C'è ancora una cosa.
One final thing?
E l'ultima è la cucitura, che è stata realizzata assieme ad un'associazione che si occupa di interventi sanitari, quindi con dei punti di sutura alla fine per riuscire a cucire insieme le pagine.
Well, bookbinding and sewing actually has been undertaken in collaboration with a professional sewing and using some medical stitch in order to really put all this together and keeping somehow the bookbinding on the same size, dimension, and it's a magnificent. You see, it's a magnificent book. But thank you, Mayor. And somehow we came back to the present times, so conscious of the time, and in a little while we're going to open up to your questions, and so feel free to share your questions using the YouTube chat on the right side of the screen. And so let's, after this kind of a journey and traveling back in time, let's go back to the contemporary times. And so, Nicholas, I'll turn over to you. What's the relevancy of the Middle Ages and the medieval culture in today's world? In our, we are again in the middle of the journey of our life in the 21st century. What we can learn from the medieval ages, and maybe some, overcoming some misunderstanding about the relevancy and the actual nature of the Middle Ages, how we can really learn from the Middle Ages for today's world.
Well, that's a tough one. The funny thing is that the Middle Ages never seems to go away as a concept as much as my colleagues and I like to attack it, even as I just did before. There's a medieval times just down the road. That's still very popular. I think medievalism for our modern culture still stands as some sort of alterity, another world that we came from, which we may necessarily not want to go back to, but we see it as some world in which we inevitably have modern roots, but it's not modern to us. And I think Dante represents that in some ways, even if you think about the structure of the Divine Comedy with Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise, where very interesting theological ideas are elaborated upon in a way that the reader doesn't even notice. So in some ways, Dante sort of takes you back, I think, to a way of thinking before the world was definitively round, before the two hemispheres were joined, and a world in which the earth was still the center of creation. And as much as to celebrate human beings and human potential, there was a sort of a sense of the earth's place, and I think mankind's place within the firmament of God, being a sort of very dominant in some ways still. But I would also just highlight that one of the things that Dante is sort of interesting for our world is that, a lot of people weren't quite sure what to make of it at first, and Dante's popularity took a lot of time to kick in. Even Petrarch claimed to Boccaccio that he didn't actually read him. I'm not quite sure that's true. But in some ways, Dante's style was still a little abrupt for Renaissance thinkers. And yet it was after that people sort of opened their hearts and minds to the beauty of the language and what he was trying to do in the architecture of the Divine Comedy. So in some ways it's just proof that Dante sort of transcended his own time and still speaks to us today.
That's absolutely great, and I like the idea of the relevance and the coexistence somehow, right, of the medieval ages and in our contemporary culture. Even I think from a book bibliographic perspective, even if we look at a medieval book, we still see some aspects of design of the page that are still present in our contemporary visual culture. Michelle, I'll turn over to you to reflect and possibly, if you can illuminate us, pun unintended, illuminate us on the actual visual strategies in decorating, historiating those beautiful artifacts. So what's the strategies for illustrating the medieval manuscripts, and why the Dante Guarneriano itself and his Historiated Lectures Initials can be so unique of its kind?
Right, yeah, well, that's another big question. Obviously, there's a very long tradition of medieval illumination, and illumination really only refers to the application of gold and silver, the metals that literally give light and reflection to a manuscript. Some will argue if you use yellow washes and light colors, it's designed to, we should call them an illuminated manuscript. But anyway, one of the things that's so interesting about Dante manuscripts, copies of the Commedia, is that they encapsulate, they distill so much of what had been learned by medieval illuminators over time, the miniaturists and so on. And there had been several different strategies of how you go about illustrating a text. Now there's a difference between a pharmacological text, which has certain diagrammatic demands and what you're going to put into it, and a text that has a narrative you need to illustrate. And so there's very basic choices that need to be made, how you're going to get that communicated on the page, whether you're going to provide a narrative or how you're going to relate the images to the text on the page. And there are a variety of strategies for doing that. And one of the interesting things about the Dante Guarneriano is that we see several of them in this one manuscript. Often a manuscript will choose one or the other and emphasize a particular format. One technique you see right on the wonderful first page here is the so-called Historiated Initial, where you put a scene right into the letter itself, which is literally embedding the image in the text. I mean, quite literally, you've got the image in the text. In Dante manuscripts, we have a vocabulary that develops fairly early on in terms of the standard iconography. In this first N, we typically see either a portrait of Dante, and we do here, Dante in his studiolo, or we see that initial moment of him meeting Virgil at the foot of the mountain, which embarks on the narrative immediately. So we have a wonderful historiated initial, very typical of manuscript illumination. If we go even to the very second canto, you want to show them?
I will.
There's another technique for embedding the image in the text, and that's what's known as the columnar illustration. And this is a very ancient manner of strategy of including illustrations, which dates back to the early centuries AD, when manuscripts were still scrolls, and the text was in columns that ran perpendicular to the direction the scroll was unfurled. And any illustration had to be contained in the columns of script, largely to avoid confusion. But that tradition of the maxima being defined by the column of writing became a very traditional way of incorporating illuminations. And we see the framed scenes start to make their appearance in the manuscript on the very second page. So already we've got this combination of strategies that begins to unfold. We also have a point in time with medieval illumination. It's not a strict chronology, but a moment when the illustrations burst out of any sort of frame and they start to snake around the top of the page. A compound scene with more than one episode included in it simultaneously. And as we get further, by the time we're at Canto 4 in the Codex Guarnerianus here, we have a compound scene that explodes out of the frame of a single column, and we have a double scene of limbo depicted. And so it goes from page to page. We seem to have different strategies. Another one has to do with color. In the early images in the Guarneriano, we have these very traditional, vibrant, deep pigments that you see on the page there. By the time we get further into the manuscript, a different technique takes over. We see more impressionistic images, which look more like pin drawings with a bit of almost a watercolor wash, these fainter pigments. And that too had a long tradition in medieval illumination, particularly in things like psalters and books of hours. So one of the things that's absolutely wonderful about the Dante Guarneriano is that it's not just an illuminated manuscript. It's sort of this laboratory in which you see all these different ways of going about the business of trying to illustrate a narrative in one manuscript. It's really quite interesting.
Very interesting. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much, Michelle. And I'm aware, so there are a few questions already. So let's take the first question from Bogna. So thank you, Bogna, for sharing how the ink was reproduced. A medieval recipe. So there's a technical question about the ink, the inchiostro. And for Bogna again, is the original Dante Guarneriano scripted on vellum or on paper? And so I will turn over the mayor for the first question about the ink on the anastatic copy. So the ink for the script, l'inchiostro per l'inchiostro nero, come è stato riprodotto?
È un inchiostro ovviamente recente, è stato riprodotto cercando di andare il più vicino possibile all'originale. Ovviamente non era possibile recuperare inchiostri dell'epoca, ma si è cercato di ottenere lo stesso tipo di effetto. Sull'altra domanda, cioè sulla carta o sulla pergamena, ovviamente l'originale è su pergamena, era impossibile, eticamente non accettabile, sopprimere alcuni greggi di bestiame per poter realizzare 13 copie del Dante Guarneriano.
Thank you. So the anastatic copy, anastatic process is one of the most sophisticated process for reproducing manuscripts like this. So essentially it's like a lithography, but rendered to the zinc plate. And the ink employed, it's the ink that mostly reproduces the original recipes of the medieval manuscripts. Talking about the paper on parchment, the original is on parchment. So I'll turn. The original is on parchment, not vellum, right?
Vellum's a particular type of parchment.
Yeah,
it's
a particular type of parchment.
It's a subset.
However, for ethical concerns in the 21st century, they didn't want to kill hundreds of animals to produce like this one a real parchment. This is a kind of you can even see the bone, the backbone of an original parchment. However, again, for ethical purposes, they didn't want to use a parchment, and that's why they turned out to use a 100% cotton fibers handmade paper, which is the highest quality of a handmade paper. 100% cotton fibers, handmade, and to again render the spirit of those times. And I see there is another question. So thank you, Mayor, for taking. Anything to add about the parchment vellum, the original copy?
The only thing I was going to say is it makes a difference what then ink you use, because parchment is sturdier and it can hold up to the medieval inks, which are incausta, and that word refers to the fact that they literally burn into the parchment and make a very solid bond. But paper, it's going to burn right through the paper, so you have to come up with a different formula. And as the medieval manuscripts do start becoming paper manuscripts, they had to change the formula for the ink.
Change the formula. Well, this is very interesting. And talking about paper and inking, actually, our scribe, our amanuensis and calligrapher kept working all the time. So later we will see something. So I see Deborah and Suzanne for your questions. Thank you. Deborah, did women have a role in manuscript production at this time? And would each page, second question by Suzanne, would each page manuscript be made by different people with different skills, or is it the work of one person with many skills? Well, I let the experts take those questions. So what about the role of women? We know something from recent studies, actually, and the role of the actual skills for making the manuscript. Michelle. Talking about women, for sure.
Well, the answer is yes, women had a role. In fact, we have very early on in the Middle Ages evidence of convents of nuns, communities of nuns who partly made a living off of being professional scribes. They would take commissions and they would produce manuscripts. They'd also produce works for their own libraries and liturgical books for themselves. but there are specific hands that we can recognize as the house hand of a certain convent of women. And this continues right into Dante's Florence. We do have communities of nuns who their business was to, that's how they supported the convent, was by copying and doing fair copies of things for other people. And certainly the illiteracy of women, I think, is overstated generally in many of our medieval histories. As far as how many people it might take to make a single manuscript, well, it does run the gamut. We have famous stories of the Book of Kells being the work of devotion of a single man who not only, I mean, I don't know that he cured the parchment, but he did the writing, he did all the decoration, and it was his offering to God, one man's work from start to finish. But the more typical way of producing manuscripts, particularly in the later Middle Ages, and when a little bit more rapidity in production was required, they did turn it into something of a production line, not page by page, but if you look at a bound book, you'll see that it's put together by a series of gatherings, what are known as quires in a book. And the typical way of going about speeding up the process was to hand out these quires to a group of monks in a scriptoria or even later on in a professional office. And we do see that in Dante manuscripts where somebody is responsible for canto 1 through 6 and somebody's responsible to pick the story up later, and they would do these various things. And likewise, the labor was divided between the types of skills. One would be doing the writing, another might be doing the rubrication, that is putting the red wash on initials to brighten them up, and then the illuminator was somebody else again. So we have variety of equations of teamwork that would go into making them. But we do have those instances of one man making his manuscript for his God too. So.
This is fascinating. Really imagine this scriptoria where a teamwork actually could execute and the beautiful rendering of the different techniques employed. And even in the Dante Guarneriano, there are different hands, right? So there is a school of Bartolomeo Florisino, but also we research, right, somehow shows that different hands were employed for the
yes,
making, right?
It does seem to be a bit of teamwork involved. And you know, one of the interesting things to look at in manuscripts when you get a chance to look at them very closely is the sort of little guides that you can find that are hidden behind what is the final product. You can see little guide letters in the margin. If this is supposed to be a big illuminated A, you'll see a tiny A in the margin. Or you'll see the underdrawing of an illumination that the master perhaps has indicated his design, but somebody else might actually be the one who applies the color or burnishes the gold. So there's teamwork at all levels.
Yeah, and speaking of teamwork, Angelo is asking, the manuscript was made in one and the same scriptorium or more than one? Do we have evidence of whether or not the manuscript was made in one scriptorium?
This particular manuscript?
This particular...
yes, it seems to be one tranche of work.
Okay.
Multiple,
and in general for
hands.
medieval codices and books, they were usually produced in one scriptorium.
One spot. You might have a wandering scribe who picked up piecework, but in terms of proper production, yeah, one place, one manuscript.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I think, well, I'm conscious of time. We're going to we're toward the conclusion of this wonderful, exciting, and marvelous journey into the Dante Guarneriano. And I think it's an endless process and sort of unfinished work. Even today, after an hour, I feel we should keep on and on reflecting and sharing. Ivano Coan has been working and still employing his calligraphic styles. I think the camera will be able later to show. And I wanted to, well, really thank you, our special guests, Nicholas Everett, Michelle Mulcahy, and Mayor Pietro Valent, for your wonderful insights. It really, well, it was a companion for our journey into the Dante Guarneriano. I wanted to thank again all the institutions that presented this event, and reminding that this is the first of a series of events. Tomorrow at St. Michael's College there will be a workshop on medieval calligraphy thanks to the Scriptorium Foro Iuliense. Another workshop will take place Friday morning here at Massey College, and finally a virtual tour live from San Daniele and Toronto to explore in real time the beautiful treasures of the Biblioteca Guarneriana. So live from San Daniele, Friday at 4:30, we will be able to really connect Toronto and San Daniele again to explore the making of a medieval manuscript. Thanks again to the Department of Italian Studies, St. Michael's College, Massey College, the Istituto di Cultura Italiana, in particular Veronica Manson for her generosity, and then the city of San Daniele and the Scriptorium Foro Iuliense. Thank you all for being with us wherever you are on YouTube and in person here in the beautiful venue of Massey College. Thanks to our staff at Massey, a beautiful crew of people that made this event possible. And thank you again, everyone. I think Ivano is still working. Do we have a camera on Ivano? So please, I invite to see the final strokes of Ivano's pen for maybe a final invitation. I can't actually. Okay, here you see. Dante Guarneriano, Massey College. With this very final words, with this very final verses and invitations. So thank you everyone for traveling with us in this journey into the making of Dante Guarneriano. Thank you everyone. Ad Maiora.
Ciao.